Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping ourselves into the time machine and setting the dial for the mid-20th century. We're going to examine the decades of volatility that forged four of rock's most, well, brilliant and volatile frontmen: Jim Morrison, Michael Hutchence, Chris Cornell, and Scott Weiland.
That's right. And our mission today is really specific. This isn't just about celebrating their music or, recounting their fame. Instead, we're diving deep into the biographical data, the psychological profiles, and the sheer geopolitical and cultural forces that shaped them right from birth.
So the idea here, the essential thesis, is that these men weren't just exceptional musicians. They were, as our sources put it, like seismographs placed directly on a societal fault line.
Exactly. Registering every single tremor and collapse of what you could call the American century.
Okay, let's unpack that core idea. We're talking about four iconic figures, but they're separated by decades. Morrison, born in the early 40s, Weiland in the late 60s. That spans from the post-war era right through to the end of the millennium, but they all arrive at the surprisingly similar tragic end. What's the central argument that connects them? What makes this deep dive so necessary?
Well, the central argument, and it's drawn pretty consistently from our sources, is one of environmental and biological destiny. To truly understand the brilliance and the eventual, almost inevitable self-destruction of these four artists, you have to understand the specific volatile environment that birthed them.
Right.
We're tracking a really radical shift here, from the rigid authoritarian, almost suffocating structures of the 1950s that shaped Jim Morrison, all the way to the fractured, chemically disillusioned, and kind of clinically chaotic landscape of the 1990s that ultimately consumed Scott Weiland.
So the environment was the crucible, but the nature of the threat itself completely changed. The overarching theme, then, is this shift from a literal atomic bomb threat to a kind of sociological atomic fallout.
Precisely. Let's start by defining this concept of the atomic playground.
Yeah.
For Jim Morrison, born in 1943, this was, well, it was literal. It was tangible anxiety.
Okay.
The atomic playground was the Cold War, that pervasive fear of nuclear annihilation, the constant threat of mutually assured destruction. It was a tangible mushroom cloud anxiety that defined the very atmosphere he breathed. It was like a background hum of existential terror.
And that feeling, that necessity of impending doom, the idea that time was short, is what drove that artistic scream, that urgency. But how did that literal atomic threat shift for the younger generation? Because that seems to be the real pivot point.
It shifted dramatically, and this is where the sources get, frankly, heartbreaking. By the time we get to Michael Hutchence, Chris Cornell, and Scott Weiland, the literal threat of the bomb was still there, of course. But the primary lived threat had become profoundly sociological. The sources highlight that for them, the atomic playground became this chemically scorched earth. It was defined by the fallout of fractured families, pervasive addiction that you could see everywhere, and the divorce epidemic that just shattered generational norms.
So the foundation was just pulled out from under them. It's the difference between worrying about a single massive bomb dropping from the sky, an external threat, and worrying about the ground crumbling beneath your feet.
Yes, because the foundation, the family unit, the stability was already gone. It was already poisoned by an internal collapse.
Exactly. The threat shifted from this potential global annihilation to a very real, personal, internal implosion. That sets the stage perfectly for part one, examining that mid-century volatility and the specific structures they were all born into.
Agreed. And we have to start at the beginning of that timeline with Jim Morrison, truly a prophet of the dawn of the atomic age.
His background reads like a prescription for rebellion, but I want to understand the source material's take on how that rigid structure actually broke him open.
The sources really emphasize that his life was defined by the rigidity and the movement of the military. He was the quintessential military brat, defined by that constant transience moving from naval base to naval base, never rooted in one geography or community.
And his life was disciplined by these rigid authoritarian structures of the U.S. Navy.
Often emotionally distant structures, yes. And that combination is the key to his entire psychological landscape.
Yeah.
You take the backdrop of nuclear anxiety, that feeling that everything could disappear in an instant, and you combine it with this relentless rootlessness.
And that creates a profound existential restlessness.
Exactly. If the world is ephemeral and the structures meant to contain you are oppressive, then your only logical response is to seek immediate, intense, boundary-shattering experiences. His whole artistic life became this profound need to break on through to the other side of fear, of convention, of that rigid military structure.
So that famous chaotic rebellion wasn't just standard rock star defiance. It was a necessary, almost intellectual response to his environment. Were the sources explicit about the patricidal nature of his art? Was he literally rejecting the system that raised him?
Absolutely. The sources make it crystal clear. His father, Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, was deeply embedded in that system. He literally commanded U.S. naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a major flashpoint of the Vietnam War.
Wow.
So Jim's chaotic art, his Lizard King persona, it was a dramatic Freudian ritual of patricide. He was rejecting the entire military-industrial complex that defined his childhood. It was a complete refusal of that suffocating conformist 1950s template.
Now, if Morrison's early life was defined by rigidity, Michael Hutchence's experience, born in 1960, seems almost diametrically opposed. He was born into what you call the golden playpen. What was that environment like?
And that's a critical contrast for understanding the generational shift. Hutchence was born in Sydney, but he spent much of his formative youth in the golden playpen of expatriate Hong Kong.
Okay, so late 60s, early 70s.
Right. An era of global economic boom, cosmopolitan freedom, and just sensory overload, fueled by the transient wealth of the international business community.
Okay.
It was the very antithesis of Morrison's regimented existence.
So if Morrison was forced to define himself against a hard, militarized wall, Hutchence defined himself through, what, sensory fluidity?
Correct. The sources describe this leading to a fluid, chameleon-like identity, one defined by sensual, economic, and cultural overload rather than by the fear of discipline or annihilation. His atomic playground wasn't geopolitical terror, it was one of economic opportunity and cultural transient wealth. He became a master observer, just sliding effortlessly between cultures and personas, always performing, always adapting.
Then we hit the younger crew, born into the actual moment of fracture. Let's start with Chris Cornell, born in '64, growing up in that gray, rain-soaked isolation of Seattle. He seems to have inherited the hangover of that playpen generation.
He absolutely did. Cornell inherited the darkening tail end of the boomer generation's promise and optimism, that shiny utopian sense of possibility, quickly transmuted into the heavy, cynical introspection that would fully define Generation X.
And the physical environment mattered intensely?
Oh, hugely. The rain and isolation of the Pacific Northwest became the metaphorical and literal atmosphere of Soundgarden's music-heavy, internal, and often deeply, deeply depressed.
And Scott Weiland, born in 1967, is, as the theory posits, a true child of that total fracture. He arrived just as everything was crashing down.
Weiland embodies the born-in-the-storm archetype perfectly. He arrived exactly as the utopian dream of the 60s collapsed. We're talking about the violence of Altamont, the Manson murders, the riots, and these radical shifts in consciousness and drug use.
He was birthed directly into the fracture, not the promise.
Yes, and his early life was also characterized by intense geographical mobility and cultural whiplash, moving repeatedly between sunny California and industrial Ohio, constantly the outsider trying to find a footing.
That theme of being birthed into the storm leads us to a crucial comparison, one that really defines the difference between these generations. How the drug culture evolved across the 25 years separating them.
This is perhaps the starkest sociological and pharmacological shift in the sources. For Morrison, born pre-collapse, the use of LSD and psychedelics was framed as an intellectual, almost religious pursuit.
Right.
He was trying to cleanse the doors of perception, drawing directly from the Blakean tradition. The goal was transcendence, seeking the void, trying to achieve a higher state by tearing down those mental barriers imposed by the military-industrial complex.
So the goal was expansion, seeking more reality, not less. But by the time we get to Cornell, and especially Weiland, the purpose is fundamentally different. That expansive search has just curdled into something far more desperate.
It absolutely had. The sources detail how the chemical culture darkened drastically into the numbing heroin chic and the widespread use of opiates in the 1990s. The chemical playground was no longer about opening doors to new realities. It was about slamming them shut against the overwhelming, chaotic pain of existence.
Wow.
Substances were used to find chemical redemption, or more tragically, just to feel normal. A profound, devastating contrast to Morrison's desire to obliterate the self and merge with the infinite.
The shift is from seeking enlightenment to seeking oblivion or just simple stasis. That pain, that biological instability, is the central point of part two, how these environmental factors triggered their genetic echoes.
Yes, exactly.
We have to start with this tragic sociological theory of the 1967 crew because it grounds Weiland's struggle in a very specific, almost fated moment. The theory posits this peculiar and tragic destiny for rock icons born in that specific year: Weiland, Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, Shannon Hoon. What do the sources say made that year so potent, so destructive?
The theory is essentially that these individuals represent a generation born at the zenith of counterculture chaos. They were conceived or born during the peak of radical societal shifts, massive environmental stressors on parents, and pervasive drug use in the cultural atmosphere.
So the idea is that being born into that environment somehow genetically and sociologically encoded these men with both the brilliant creativity and the self-destructive nihilism.
That's the core of it. Encoded is a strong word, but that's the feeling.
Wait, what mechanisms do the sources suggest translated the chaos of 1967 into this nihilistic code? Is it purely cultural, or is there a biological suggestion there?
Well, the discussion often straddles those cultural and biological lines.
Huh.
Culturally, they lacked the rigid boundary to push against. They were given total freedom, but, no guide map. Biologically, there's speculation, though it's very difficult to prove definitively, that factors like parental stress hormones during all that social upheaval, or just early childhood environmental instability, might have contributed to developing brains that were less resilient to internal chaos and external trauma.
So they didn't have the 1950s template of stability to recoil from. They were born into the recoil itself.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which makes Morrison the shaman, the conscious instigator calling forth the cultural storm, whereas the 1967 cohort was just collateral damage, born in the eye of the chaos and destined to inherit the exhaustion and the cleanup.
Exactly. Morrison was performing the ritual. The 1967 crew were the ritual's victims, born with the scars already showing. Cornell, born a few years earlier in 1964, acts as this fascinating bridge or elder statesman.
Right.
He possessed the brooding depth of grunge, but he initially carried a resilience, a sense of survival, perhaps from being just outside the epicenter that the 1967 cohort tragically lacked. And Hutchence, born in 1960, he bridged that external hedonism of the classic rock era with the later clinical depression that plagued the 90s crew.
What's truly fascinating here, and what the sources reveal, is the core finding that these men were often victims of a biology ill-equipped for the environment they found themselves in. It strips away the romanticism of the tortured artist and just replaces it with stark clinical reality.
It completely shifts the narrative from, say, a moral failing or a poetic choice to biological predisposition and destiny. Let's look at the specific pathologies, and let's try to translate some of the clinical jargon into behavioral consequences for you.
Weiland's specific struggles are a case study in this, focusing on bipolar disorder. How did that manifest and directly influence his addiction?
Scott Weiland suffered profoundly from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Behaviorally, this means extreme disruptive mood swings. The manic highs fueled his chameleon-like stage presence and explosive bursts of creativity, but the crushing lows meant he was often non-functional, depressed, and anxious.
And he openly admitted to self-medicating, using heroin and cocaine not for a psychedelic trip, but specifically to manage those swings.
Yes, and we need to understand that bipolar heroin cocktail, for someone with bipolar disorder, the brain is constantly racing, cycling between extremes, generating this overwhelming noise.
So heroin felt like normalcy. How?
Heroin, an opiate, is a powerful depressant. The sources explain that when Weiland used it, the drug provided a pharmacological silence, a stasis, that his brain just couldn't achieve naturally. It didn't just numb the pain, it quieted the manic energy and lifted the heavy depression, allowing him a brief, chemically induced moment of equilibrium.
So it was an attempt at self-regulated psychiatry.
A tragically fatal one. And when you couple that with what's described as narcissistic trauma, rooted in his fragmented early life, you have a fundamental identity crisis he couldn't outrun.
And Cornell's struggles were rooted in a lifelong battle with major depressive disorder and anxiety, which sounds less chaotic, but maybe even more insidious.
Precisely. Chris Cornell's battle began in earnest during his teenage years. The sources note he experienced severe depression and crippling social anxiety. This was likely exacerbated by a family history of alcoholism, indicating a clear biological predisposition. For a man who possessed one of the most commanding voices in rock history, his stage presence was a hard-won victory over intense internal struggle.
His stoicism was like a fortress.
A psychological fortress built against that siege of anxiety and depression. His use of substances, particularly alcohol and later prescription meds, was similarly driven by a need to quell the noise and manage anxiety, not to transcend reality.
Morrison's pathologies, though less clinically defined back in the 60s, certainly fit this pattern of profound instability.
His erratic, destructive behavior, combined with severe alcoholism, leads experts today to suggest traits strongly associated with borderline personality disorder or a similar severe mood dysregulation. The crucial difference is that in the permissive drug culture of the 60s, these pathologies weren't identified or treated. They were often encouraged, celebrated, mistaken for genius. The environment just exacerbated the biology.
Then there is Michael Hutchence, whose issues were later fundamentally and tragically compounded by a catastrophic external event.
That's the most heartbreakingly clinical detail of all. Hutchence was already a sensory seeker, defined by adulation and excess, but his struggles were severely compounded by the traumatic brain injury, the TBI. He suffered in a random road rage assault in Copenhagen in 1992. He suffered a fractured skull, resulting in anosmia, the total loss of smell and taste, and critically significant frontal lobe damage.
The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that manages our decision-making and impulse control, correct?
That's absolutely key. The frontal lobe is the brain's chief executive officer. It's responsible for planning, judgment, emotional regulation, impulse control. Damage there causes TBI-induced aggression, profound depression, and highly erratic, reckless behavior.
And his friends and bandmates often mistook this for just rock star excess.
Tragically, yes. They saw drug-fueled tantrums, not realizing that his brain chemistry and his internal CEO had been permanently physically damaged. It was a biological injury compounding existing emotional vulnerabilities, turning a charismatic seeker into an aggressive, despairing man.
This level of detail just makes you realize the narrative isn't about artistic chaos, but often about untreated medical conditions. Which brings us back full circle to the shadow of the father, the societal structure they were rejecting.
The shadow of the father is central to their personal mythologies, because the nature of the rebellion differed so greatly depending on what they were rebelling against. For Morrison, we have the immense, rigid military shadow of his admiral father. Jim's chaotic art was a deliberate Freudian ritual of patricide, rejecting that entire authoritarian 1950s structure.
But Hutchence, with his charming, charismatic corporate father, Kel Hutchence, dealt with a more absent presence, the corporate shadow.
This is the critical distinction. Kel Hutchence was a successful, globe-trotting businessman who bequeathed Michael his easy charm and confidence, yes. But the constant movement and corporate lifestyle left Michael with a profound void of identity, a rootlessness he desperately tried to fill with adulation and sensory excess. He was rebelling against the emptiness of the corporate hotel room, the superficiality, not the domination of a rigid father. It was a rebellion against emptiness.
And the younger guys, Weiland and Cornell, dealt with structures that were either fractured or just less overtly powerful.
Scott Weiland's identity was deeply fractured by the absence of his biological father and his subsequent adoption. His rebellion was driven by a desperate need to construct a self in that vacuum. He was always trying on different personas. Cornell rejected the middle-class structure of his pharmacist father, Edward Boyle, even adopting his mother's maiden name as his stage name. The defining commonality, regardless of the father's role, was the rejection of the structure that tried to contain them, military, corporate, or middle class. The theme of the transient child who never found a home runs deep.
That rootlessness, that sense of being a permanent outsider, seems to have profoundly fueled their lyrical trademarks and stage personas.
It absolutely did. Hutchence's childhood in Hong Kong made him a permanent observer, viewing the world through the glass of a hotel window. This transience denied him a solid foundation, but allowed him to be this vocal and physical chameleon. In INXS's early tracks like Just Keep Walking, that anxiety of the urban wanderer is palpable. He sings of hating the world because it was too cold.
Weiland's cultural whiplash California to Ohio and back, that created the sense of fragmentation in his lyrics.
It fueled the lyrics of Stone Temple Pilots' classic Creep, where he sings of being half the man I used to be and always being on the outside looking in. His identity was constructed from moving parts. And Morrison, of course, famously claimed his parents were dead in early press materials, performing this symbolic act of self-orphaning to embrace total rootlessness. This mobility forced them all to become chameleons who could master any stage, but felt fundamentally at home on none.
Okay, let's pivot to part 3 and discuss how geography dictated the sound of their internal struggles. In rock music, geography is destiny. We need to contrast the gray, claustrophobic atmosphere of Seattle with the neon theatricality of Los Angeles.
This contrast is foundational to understanding the output of Cornell versus Morrison and Weiland. Chris Cornell and Soundgarden were forged in the gray, industrial damp of Seattle. Their music, reflecting this environment, was heavy, down-tuned, and sludgy, mirroring atmospheric and emotional oppression. It was inward-turning music.
And they weren't just using standard tuning. This is where we need to get into the technical details. Kim Thayil's techniques, the drop D tunings, the odd time signatures, and explain why that created a feeling of unease.
That's an essential layer. The use of drop D tunings, tuning the lowest string down a full step, gives the guitar a much heavier, darker, more dissonant sound. But crucially, they employed odd time signatures. Listen to the 74 in Outshined or the 64 in Fell on Black Days.
Okay, so for someone who doesn't read music, what does 74 feel like?
It feels unstable. Normal rock music is built on 44, a steady, march-like rhythm. When you shift to 74, the measure feels like it's tripping over itself. It creates a jarring, uneasy, introverted landscape, perfectly suited for Cornell's lyrics of existential dread. The environment dictated a turning inward, cultivating the void as a place of brooding, heavy creativity.
So the musical structure itself was a metaphor for internal chaos, a feeling that things are permanently off-kilter. Now contrast that deep introversion with the LA of Morrison and Weiland, the city of night.
Los Angeles was blinding neon, sunshine, theatrical excess. The Doors' sound was airy, psychedelic, driven by that tension between glamour and grime, the LA woman who was both muse and destroyer. Famously, they often lacked a conventional bass player, with Ray Manzarek's classical training and carnival-esque Vox Continental organ covering the low end. That keyboard sound gave their music an open, slightly haunted quality that reflected LA's promise and its hollowness.
And Weiland's Stone Temple Pilots, though tagged with grunge, were technically and stylistically quintessentially LA in their sophistication.
They absolutely were. While they adopted the heavy distortion of the grunge era, STP was fundamentally polished, glamorously chameleonic, and technically complex. The DeLeo brothers incorporated sophisticated jazz and bossa nova chords that reflected the sun-drenched, artificial, eclectic nature of Southern California. The essential difference is clear. LA demanded performance. It required a mask. Seattle demanded a raw, often painful authenticity.
That brings us right into the architecture of the band itself, which our sources call the tuning fork for the frontman's chaos. Explain how the stability of the band provided the necessary counterweight.
The frontman's the chaos, the volatile element. But the band is the structure that keeps the art from completely flying apart. Morrison, without the structure provided by Ray Manzarek's classical training and the hypnotic organ lines, would have been merely a talented, drunken poet yelling on Venice Beach. Manzarek provided the musical floor, grounding Morrison's shamanic flights, turning his improvisations into structured songs.
It sounds like the band was the only thing preventing total collapse long enough to create art. In Soundgarden, Cornell's immense 4-octave vocal range, that sheer sonic power, needed something equally dense to push against.
Exactly. The sheer sonic energy of Cornell's voice needed an anchor. That was Kim Thayil's heavy, complex guitar work and his deliberate use of those jarring, uneven time signatures. Thayil created the dense, uneasy, almost metallic landscape that perfectly suited Cornell's existential dread. When Cornell screamed into the void, Thayil's unique guitar textures made sure the void screamed back with metallic precision.
And the other two. Hutchence and Weiland relied heavily on rhythmic and musical precision to support their chameleonic roles.
Absolutely essential. Hutchence's band, INXS, driven largely by the Ferris brothers, was an unshakable funk rock and new wave machine. Andrew Ferris's rhythmic precision acted as a complete, unfailing tether for Michael's wild god persona. He could be the sensual, wandering showman because the musical foundation was unshakable. For Weiland, the DeLeo brothers provided a sophisticated, jazz-inflected musical bed that allowed him to shift personas flawlessly, from the grunge growler and sex-type thing to the glam-pop androgen of later material.
Okay, let's look at the actual poetry now. The debut lyrics, the early lyrical manifestos, seem to have revealed the seeds of their ultimate fates, almost like psychological blueprints.
They absolutely function as premonitions. Morrison's Break On Through, to the other side, is the definitive manifesto of transgression, a demand to shatter societal boundaries. It's the first scream of a soul refusing to be contained.
Cornell's debut lyrics were already paranoid and deeply claustrophobic.
Yes. Soundgarden's early track, Hunted Down, is a cry of entrapment, not liberation. They're out to get me, he sings, establishing that theme of constant internal siege that defined his depression. It reflects the hunted nature of the chronic anxiety he battled, a sense that the walls were always closing in.
Weiland's Dead and Bloated, the opener of the core album, is astonishingly nihilistic right out of the gate.
It's grotesque. It's a proclamation of decay from the very start, showing he was birthed into the fracture. I am smelling like the rose that somebody gave me on my birthday deathbed. He is recognizing the rot beneath the rock star facade from day one, and significantly, he sings that initial verse through the pickup of a guitar, deliberately distorting and muffling his voice.
Already hiding.
Already hiding behind technology, creating a sonic barrier between himself and the listener.
Hutchence, again, is the odd one out, focusing on the visceral, immediate struggle rather than the metaphysical.
His early lyrics in Just Keep Walking are an anthem of urban survival. It's focused purely on the need to physically survive the night and keep moving. It lacks the metaphysical weight of the others, but its sheer urgency echoes tragically in his final hours.
Moving into part 4, we reach the point where the void stares back. We have to discuss the tragedy of the long, slow fade and what ultimately brought these men down. We must start with Michael Hutchence because his turning point was so clinical and external.
The 1992 assault in Copenhagen was not just a fight. It was the singularity in Michael Hutchence's life, a critical turning point that often gets lost in the generic narrative of rock star excess. We already established the result: fractured skull, anosmia, and significant frontal lobe damage.
Let's dwell on the clinical consequences of that frontal lobe damage. How did that translate into the behavior his bandmates tragically misread?
This is crucial. When the frontal lobe is damaged, the executive function, the ability to modulate intense emotion, think about consequences, control impulses, is severely impaired. The forces detail how this caused severe TBI-induced aggression, manic depression, and profoundly erratic, risk-taking behavior. Hutchence suddenly lacked the internal filter that would normally stop him from exploding in rage.
That is just devastating for a sensory-driven artist defined by his charm and sensuality. The loss of smell and taste must have been profoundly disorienting.
It was existentially damaging. The sources provide the heartbreaking detail that Hutchence reportedly cried, "I can't even taste my girlfriend anymore." It underscores the devastation for a man whose life was literally defined by sensory exploration. He was severed from the world he was built to inhabit, leaving him with an inescapable internal vacuum that fueled his descent.
We need to circle back to the drug evolution here, comparing the role of substances in their later lives. That shift from escapism as transcendence to escapism as just pharmacological normalization.
This contrast defines the generations. In Morrison's youth, a song like The Crystal Ship suggests a beautiful, fragile vehicle for transcendence or oblivion. The drug was used to expand the self. But for Scott Weiland and the younger cohort, the function of opiates was purely pharmacological normalization, a chemical retreat.
He used heroin to silence the noise, not to expand the mind.
Precisely. Weiland explicitly linked his heroin use to a desperate hunger for redemption and a fundamental need to quell the chaos of his bipolar mind. The drug wasn't about seeing God. It was about feeling steady, about finding normalcy within the unrelenting internal storm. This contrast is the essence of the generational shift, from the psychedelic expansion of the 60s to the opiate numbness of the 90s, where the goal was just to escape the overwhelming pain.
The mythology of Morrison's death at 27, the famous 27 Club, froze him in amber, the permanent young lion. A tragedy of potential. But the others suffered the long, slow fade, a tragedy of endurance that we watched in real time.
Time is the ultimate critic and destroyer of myth. Morrison's death is a sudden, perfect tragedy. The others, Hutchence at 37, Weiland at 48, Cornell at 52, endured years of highly public meltdowns, relapse, and agonizing decline. Their deaths were not romantic exits, but tragic clinical collapses that reflected the long trajectory of their struggles.
Let's detail the final scenes and how they reflect the specific nature of their lives, starting with Morrison's Paris exile in 1971.
Morrison's flight to Paris was his final, decisive rejection of Jim Morrison, the rock star. He was seeking anonymity as James Douglas Morrison, the poet, desperate to find the word in the silence, a return to the womb of literature. His official cause of death was heart failure, but the lack of an autopsy and the rumors of a heroin overdose speak to the chaotic path of his final months.
Hutchence died in the tragic, lonely reality of a hotel room, far from his golden playpen.
Room 524 at the Ritz-Carlton. His death reflects the perfect storm of his final years. The TBI-induced aggression and despair, compounded by a desperate cocktail of substances, cocaine, alcohol, Prozac fueled by custody battles and professional isolation. He died a direct victim of biological injury.
Scott Weiland's death is perhaps the most grim and unglamorous end of all, a brutal consequence of the long fade.
It is the brutal reality of the aging rock addict who never found stability. found stiff in a tour bus bedroom in Bloomington, Minnesota. The death was ruled an accidental overdose of cocaine, ethanol, and MDA, tragically complicated by pre-existing cardiovascular disease. The sources emphasized the setting. The road, once the path to freedom, had become a prison and a dead end.
And finally, Chris Cornell's last performance in Detroit. Observers noted he was off. His death, seemingly sudden, appears to be the ultimate triumph of his lifelong internal siege.
Observers noted he seemed fundamentally off, mentally absent during the final show, which tragically ended with a cover of Led Zeppelin's In My Time of Dying. Found in his hotel room shortly after, the tragedy was compounded by the presence of Ativan in his system, a benzodiazepine used for anxiety. This suggests a chemical impairment that may have lowered his inhibitions, disabling his ability to resist the suicidal impulse, the black hole sun of his depression, allowing it to finally take over.
Wow.
He was a functional addict, the survivor of years of internal war, until in that chemically impaired moment, he wasn't.
So, after tracking these 4 distinct yet parallel descents, from the authoritarian Cold War to the opiates of the grunge era, what does this all mean for their legacy?
Despite the similar tragic ends, their legacies are fixed in different mythological states. Morrison remains the immortal Lizard King myth, Cornell, the voice of a generation, Hutchence, the lost sex symbol, and Weiland, the tragic chameleon. But the essential alchemy that connects them remains the same.
The band tuned the poetry into heaven. They took the raw, ugly biological pain, the profound rootlessness, and the chemical chaos of the frontman and created art that was consumable, relatable, and transformative for millions of listeners.
The band was the crucial bridge, the mechanical vessel that contained the volatile essence. Manzarek's classical structure, Tayl's heavy riffs, the Delio's jazz chords, the Ferris Brothers' funk machine. These were the necessary, unshakable foundations. The void was the source of their pain and their lyrical genius, but the band was the mechanism that allowed that pain to become something eternal.
We look to these men, these intensely talented but ultimately pleasantly flawed individuals, to provide the catharsis we cannot generate ourselves. They burned intensely in the atomic playground, paying the cost of their poetry in biological and social currency, so we, the audience, could watch the fire from a safe, comfortable distance.
And that leads to an important final thought for you, the listener. Michael Hutchence saying this ain't the good life, encapsulating the disillusionment they all felt. We've synthesized how the converging forces of biology, bipolar disorder, TBI, severe depression, combined with the sociological fallout of the Cold War and fractured families, created a perfect storm for this specific generation of artists. The critical question for you to explore now is this. What current pervasive societal anxieties, be it technological isolation, the collapse of global narratives, the relentless pressure of digital identity, are shaping the destructive brilliance of the artists emerging today? And what will their final chemically or psychologically written verse look like a decade from now?
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the chaos of biographical and critical source material, the sprawling articles, the dense research, the personal notes, and distill it into a coherent, crystallized narrative.
Today, we are undertaking a pretty deep dive into the foundational non-musical forces that sculpted the inner lives and public personas of four definitive frontmen: Jim Morrison, Michael Hutchence, Chris Cornell, and Scott Weiland.
And their lives, those separated by decades and, geography, reveal these striking, almost tragic patterns.
They really do.
That's right. Our mission today is to extract what the sources are calling the surprising dual mechanism that shaped these titans of rock. We're really looking for the forces that created both the profound artistic voids they sought to fill.
And on the other side of that coin, the iconic genre-defining sounds they ultimately delivered to the world.
It's a fascinating duality.
It is. The sources outline a very clear psychological and environmental model. You have the paternal shadow, which provided the foundational blueprint for their rebellion.
The blueprint, okay.
Yeah, the necessary friction and, in some cases, trauma that really set their trajectory. And then you have the geography, the physical environment of their youth, specifically, the damp introspection of Seattle versus the performative glittering glare of LA.
And that supplied the materials.
Exactly. The materials they used to build their distinctive sonic worlds. One gives you the why, the other gives you the how.
Okay, let's establish the stage here, because we're dealing with a really sprawling chronological scope. Jim Morrison was born in 1943, right on the cusp of the modern age.
The atomic age.
Right. And Scott Weiland, the youngest of this group, He was born in the sociological crucible of 1967. So the external world they inherited must be just as crucial as the internal friction they felt.
Oh, it's fundamental. Absolutely. The context dictated the quality of their internal struggles. Morrison arrived at the literal dawn of the atomic age. I mean, think about that geopolitical landscape for a second.
Cold War.
The Cold War, the binary terror of it all. It was this ideological clash where the threat of nuclear annihilation was just normalized. The sources really emphasized that his entire psychological framework was rooted in this atomic playground.
An atomic playground, that's a powerful image.
Isn't it? This ever-present threat necessitated a frantic, almost desperate search for immediate, intense, boundary-shattering experience.
So Morrison's rebellion wasn't just against an authority figure, his father. It was a rebellion against the existential terror and the kind of rigid structure of the entire post-war atomic age establishment.
Exactly. His rebellion was this expansive, almost manic response to a world that was simultaneously promised, suburban stability and instant obliteration. He was pushing the limits because the limits themselves seemed inherently fragile, temporary.
And then the others, Hutchence, Cornell, Weiland, they emerge in the wake of that initial blast. The sources describe Cornell and Weiland as being birthed into the fracture.
I love that phrase.
Me too. They inherited the deep cynicism of Generation X after the baby boom's optimistic, structured model had just collapsed. They weren't fighting the bomb anymore.
No, they were fighting the sociological fallout.
Right.
Precisely. For them, the atomic backdrop had evolved. It was no longer the literal nuclear threat. It was the fragmentation of society, the rise in divorce rates, the economic downturns of the 70s, the total failure of the American dream to deliver on its promise. They inherited a cynical world where optimism was seen as, well, naive.
And that difference is mirrored so perfectly in their substance use. This is a fascinating area of contrast in the sources. The whole philosophical underpinning of drug culture just shifts completely across this timeline.
It's a night and day difference.
Yeah.
For Morrison and the 60s generation, LSD and psychedelics were framed as tools of expansion and exploration.
A kind of intellectual pursuit.
A blatant intellectual pursuit, exactly. The goal was to cleanse the doors of perception. You wanted to achieve transcendence, to open the void and peer into it. It was an active exploration.
But by the time Weiland and Cornell came of age in the 90s, that same chemical landscape was, it was entirely different.
It had been chemically scorched. The vibrant, expansive psychedelia of the 60s had curdled into the heavy, numbing heroin chic of the later era. And the sources highlight this crucial distinction. Substances were no longer used to open doors to the infinite,
but to close them.
Explicitly to close them against the intolerable immediate pain of existence. It's a profound shift from seeking transcendence to seeking oblivion. From the manic high of the Lizard King to the, sludgy, down-tuned numbness of grunge.
That sets the stage beautifully. The external world established the parameters of the conflict, but now we need to turn inward to the engine of that conflict, the shadow of the father. The sources argue this shadow was the primary psychological engine that drove their rebellion, but the type of shadow dictated the nature of the revolt.
The father figure, whether he's present or absent, becomes the ultimate point of origin for the rock persona. In rejecting or, fleeing that figure, they define themselves and, in turn, their music.
So let's start with the most spectacular high-stakes example, Jim Morrison, and what the sources label the military shadow, the overthrow.
This is truly operatic in scale. Jim Morrison's father was not just a career naval man. He was Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison.
And crucially,
in 1964, he was the commander of U.S. naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
the very incident that dramatically escalated the Vietnam War.
The flashpoint. Which places the admiral literally and ideologically at the epicenter of the most rigid, authoritarian, and violent structure of 1950s and 60s America. The very military-industrial complex that his son would later spend his entire short, brilliant career attacking.
So the conflict wasn't just personal friction. It wasn't just a dad and his rebellious son.
No, it was an ideological war played out in the family unit. The son represented anarchy, poetry, and rebellion. The father represented absolute structured order and military power.
And the source material points directly to the infamous performance of The End, specifically that spoken word section as what they call a direct, necessary Freudian ritual of patricide.
Yes.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with that specific critical theory term, Freudian ritual of patricide, can you elaborate on why that specific chant, "Father, yes, son, I want to kill you, is labeled a ritual rather than just a shocking lyric.
Absolutely. It goes so far beyond simple shock value. In Freudian terms, the father is the first obstacle to the son's desires. He represents societal law, order, the establishment. So a ritual of patricide suggests a symbolic public act of severance.
So it's performance art.
It's a ceremony. Jim wasn't just expressing aggression toward his dad on record. He was staging a public dramatic ceremony to overthrow the established law, the paterfamilias, and all the rigid rules the admiral represented. His rebellion was chaotic, loud, aimed at overthrowing an entire political and psychological structure. He used the stage as the forum for a full-scale frontal assault on authority.
That really explains why his rebellion was so public and so intensely confrontational. It had to be.
It had to be.
Now, let's pivot entirely to Michael Hutchence, who navigated something very different, the corporate shadow, the void. His father, Kel Hutchence, was this charismatic, successful businessman.
Right. And his career demanded immense family mobility, including that key formative period living as an expatriate in Hong Kong.
And the sources suggest that Kel Hutchence gifted his son immense natural charm and charisma, which, became integral to Michael's stage presence, that sleek, fluid, wild god persona.
Oh, absolutely. But that success came at a cost. The transient corporate lifestyle created a profound void of identity. Unlike Morrison, who was dealing with an overbearing structure, Hutchence was dealing with rootlessness and instability, all of it masked by material success.
So the rebellion here wasn't against rigid discipline or some overt authority figure.
No.
It was against the sheer emptiness, the polished superficiality of corporate transience.
Precisely. Morrison fought domination. Hutchence fought the lack of depth, the inherent emptiness of constantly moving from one five-star hotel to the next. He rebelled by consuming the world whole, using sensory excess, the whole rock star lifestyle, to fill the void left by that transient childhood. His revolt was internalized, focused on seeking authentic, visceral experience in a world he felt was artificial.
I have to interject here and maybe challenge the premise just a little. If Kel Hutchence also bequeathed his son charisma, isn't that a positive inheritance rather than a shadow? Or is the shadow simply the source of the charisma?
That's a great question.
A charm built on superficial interaction and the necessity of constantly adapting to new environments.
That's a critical distinction, and the sources suggest it's the latter. The charisma was a survival mechanism. It was the ability to charm your way into a new social circle every 6 months because you had to. The shadow isn't the charm itself, but the rootlessness that required the charm to be so highly developed.
Ah, I see.
Kel's success and his charisma came packaged with profound instability, and that's psychological instability. That is the true inheritance.
Okay, that makes sense. Moving to the younger generation then, Chris Cornell and Scott Weiland experience a different form of paternal conflict. The internal absent shadow, which translated into a search for a complete self.
Yeah, for Chris Cornell, the conflict was less dramatic than Morrison's, but, perhaps more insidious.
Yeah.
His father was a pharmacist dealing in the very chemicals that would eventually haunt Cornell's life.
Wow.
Yeah. The idea being that his father was involved in the world of predictable, structured chemical solutions. Chris later rejected that in favor of the emotional intensity of rock, only to find himself entangled in the much darker chemical reality of addiction.
It's a subtle rejection of that predictable American middle-class Catholic structure.
A very subtle rejection.
Yeah.
And the sources emphasize that rejection by noting that Cornell actively rejected his father's surname.
Right. He used his mother's maiden name.
Yeah. He adopted his mother's maiden name. It was an immediate internalized rejection of that predictable path. It shows a deep need to forge an entirely new identity, separate from the quiet, structured world his father represented. His battle was internal, focused on depression and anxiety, mirroring the quiet dissatisfaction that can fester just beneath the surface of apparent middle-class stability.
And Scott Weiland's situation, conversely, was defined by a massive vacuum.
Absolutely, a total vacuum. Weiland's identity was fractured from the very start. He was born Scott Klein, abandoned by his biological father, Kent Klein, and later adopted by David Weiland. His struggle wasn't about overthrowing an admiral.
No.
It was about seeking a self in the profound void left by abandonment.
The sources refer to this specific dynamic as narcissistic trauma. Now, for listeners less familiar with that specific psychological term, how did this trauma specifically manifest in Weiland's art? Is it simply about abandonment, or is there something more complex going on?
Oh, it's far more complex than simple abandonment. Narcissistic trauma in this context suggests that the foundational sense of self, that unconditional love that you need in early development, was just missing. And when that foundation is absent, the individual spends their life trying to build an external identity.
One that can attract validation.
Yes, validation and attention to fill that internal void.
Yeah.
And this translates directly into his artistic methodology.
The constant shift in persona, the chameleon.
Exactly. His rebellion wasn't against an authority figure. It was a desperate, ongoing search for a stable self. He was constantly shifting personas, from the grunge grunter to the glam androgyne, because the original foundation was missing, leaving him feeling perpetually fractured and incomplete. The stage became the only place where he could successfully inhabit a complete, if temporary, identity.
That's a powerful insight. So the blueprint for rebellion was set by the father, whether it was through confrontation, consumption, or seeking. But the specific dynamics of the resulting psychological fracture were entirely unique to each man's early life and their paternal relationship.
And that psychological fracture connects directly to the second major theme, rootlessness. The fathers provided the motive for the split. Now, we see how their shared experience of mobility provided the method to become perpetual outsiders.
And that became a signature lyrical trademark.
Absolutely.
That permanent sense of being untethered, the transient child syndrome, becomes their lyrical strength. They were observers who didn't fully belong, and that detachment allowed them to describe the world with this painful, beautiful clarity.
Precisely. They never belonged. And that detachment became the lens through which they wrote their greatest, most anxious songs.
Let's focus first on Hutchence, who the sources call the permanent outsider. His childhood in Hong Kong is highlighted as the defining experience.
It is. Being an expatriate child is a unique form of transience. You're often wealthy, privileged, but you're fundamentally disconnected from the native culture and perpetually aware that your stay is temporary. Hutchence was moving between international schools and cultures, making him a perpetual outsider, viewing the world, as one source describes it, through the cold, isolating reflection of the glass of a hotel window.
And that must breed a specific kind of restless anxiety, which you can hear right in that early INXS track, Just Keep Walking.
Oh, it's a profound anthem of urban, existential survival. The fear is palpable, reflecting that foundational anxiety that stopping means disappearing.
If you stop moving.
If you stop moving, if you lay down roots, you become vulnerable. The lyrics capture that deep, youthful disconnect born of constant movement and temporary attachments. I hated the world. It was too cold. I hated my friends. They were too old.
It's the voice of someone whose connection to any community is conditional and fleeting.
Exactly.
Scott Weiland, operating 2 decades later, experienced a different, more jarring flavor of mobility, what the sources are terming cultural whiplash.
Yeah.
That back-and-forth movement between California and Ohio sounds genuinely destabilizing.
It created a genuine dislocation, not just a physical one. Moving between the laid-back, eclectic, often artificial landscape of Southern California and the more structured traditional Midwest that forces a constant recalibration of your identity. He was a California kid in Ohio, an immediate outsider.
Right.
And then, when he returned to California, he carried the lingering trauma and self-doubt of the Midwest back with him.
And he channeled this profound dislocation directly into one of Stone Temple Pilots' most famous tracks, Creep.
That track is just a raw, brutal expression of that fragmented identity that resulted from the whiplash. He sings of being half the man I used to be, a deeply telling lyric about self-division. His identity was constructed from constantly shifting, moving parts, trying to fit the mold of wherever he landed, but always underneath, feeling like an imposter.
Never possessing a cohesive original self.
Never. The constant need to adapt to new cultures prevented the development of a stable core.
Jim Morrison, who was also a military brat and moved constantly with his father's naval postings, he took this concept and just elevated it to an artistic philosophy.
He didn't just accept transience, he weaponized it. He performed it. He amplified his physical rootlessness by engaging in what the sources call a symbolic act of self-orphaning.
Famously telling early press that his parents were dead.
Yes. And this detail is so crucial to his entire mythology.
He erased his past entirely to create a blank canvas for the Lizard King. But what specific freedom did that fabricated identity actually grant him?
Immense freedom. By claiming total detachment from the past and all familial obligations, he could embrace total rootlessness. He didn't have to answer to a place, a family, or conventional history. This allowed him to fully function as the untethered observer, the shamanic figure who could adapt to any stage, command any crowd, but never had to be truly at home anywhere.
So he untied the anchor completely.
Completely. To achieve maximum poetic and performative freedom, but at the ultimate cost of any real psychological grounding.
So the pattern is clear. The fodder set the necessary blueprint for rebellion, and the transient childhood provided the method, the ability to operate as a charismatic, poetic outsider. Now let's talk about where they ended up geographically and how that environment dictated their sound.
Hmm.
We're moving into the idea that geography is destiny, examining the fundamental contrast between Seattle and Los Angeles.
This is where the void finds its specific physical and sonic form. The source material makes a really powerful case that the environment dictated where the void was explored and how it ultimately sounded. We see a fundamental split: the introspective, heavy, gray dampness of the Pacific Northwest.
Versus the theatrical, neon, glamorous glare of Southern California.
Exactly.
So let's start with Seattle and Chris Cornell, the epicenter of what the sources call atmospheric oppression and introspection.
Soundgarden was formed and forged in the gray industrial damp of Seattle. The climate and the culture of that city, isolated, rainy, perpetually overcast, it dictated an absolute turning inward. It cultivated the void as a place of brooding creativity and hibernation.
And crucially,
the sources note there was an intense, almost moral demand for authenticity in the Seattle scene. Superficiality just could not thrive under that constant gray sky. It would look ridiculous.
and that mandated introspection resulted in a specific, physical, down-tuned sound.
Yes. The music had to match the environment. It was heavy, sludgy, and down-tuned, mirroring the atmospheric oppression. Technically, the sources highlight the widespread use of drop D tunings favored by guitarist Kim Thale and Cornell.
And that drop tuning, it lowers the pitch.
Right. It gives the instruments a much lower, darker resonance. This choice created a literal sonic weight that anchored Cornell's incredible wailing 4-octave vocals.
So when you listen to tracks like Black Hole Sun or Jesus Christ Pose, that claustrophobia, that density, it isn't just a mood, it's the sound of the Seattle landscape translated into musical physics.
Exactly. The low, dense sonic weight is the sound of heavy stone and constant rain. The creative act in Seattle was about turning inward to battle the demons in the dark.
Now, let's travel down the coast about 1,000 miles to Los Angeles, the land of theatrical glamour and performance, which claimed both Jim Morrison and Scott Weiland. This is not a place for hibernation.
Not at all. L.A. is the city of night, defined by the constant jarring tension between the blinding promise of neon glamour, Hollywood, and the underlying urban grime and superficiality. This environment demanded not just introspection, but a constant, slick performance.
The Doors' sound is the perfect sonic reflection of that theatrical, artificial tension.
It was intentionally theatrical and carnival-esque. I mean, think about the unique instrumental structure of the band. The sources emphasize the purposeful lack of a live bass player.
Which is a huge choice.
It's a huge choice, acoustically. Without the grounded low end of a bass, the sound becomes airy, untethered, and hypnotic, driven instead by Ray Manzarek's piercing Vox Continental organ.
And the organ, it's often associated with churches or circuses. It immediately lends that religious yet slightly unstable quality to their music.
It absolutely does. The organ sound is the sound of the LA Strip psychedelic, airy, unanchored, perfectly reflecting the artificial, ephemeral nature of Southern California. The music mirrored the LA scene. A place of muses and destroyers, a place where reality was always subordinate to myth and performance.
And Scott Weiland, even though he emerged during the era of grunge, remained fundamentally a product of LA.
Quintessentially, LA's Stone Temple Pilots, even at their heaviest, were glamorous, polished, and chameleonic. They resisted the pure grit of Seattle. The sources point out that their sound incorporated sophisticated jazz chords thanks to the DeLeo brothers. Their eclectic, polished nature and ability to shift seamlessly between genres reflected the sun-drenched, artificial, and musically diverse environment of LA, where image was paramount.
So if Seattle created music for introverts and demanded authenticity through sonic weight, LA created music for showmen and demanded constant reinvention and performance through musical lightness and theatrical flair. The difference is profound.
It is.
Cornell built his artistic house of heavy, grounded Seattle stone. Morrison and Weiland built theirs of LA neon and glass.
It is the difference between the deep, consistent sonic weight and angst of a track like Soundgarden's Fell on Black Days, which sounds like the earth swallowing itself.
Right.
And the polished, shifting sonic landscape you hear across STP's career, which could move from garage rock to glam to bossa nova, influences seemingly overnight. The LA environment favored versatility over consistency.
Okay, we've established the psychological blueprint from the father and the environmental materials from the geography. Now let's look at the construction crew, the bands themselves. The source material refers to them beautifully as the alchemical bands.
I love that term.
Me too. Acting as a tuning fork that translated all this intense internal psychological and geographical pressure into external art.
The frontmen were the raw, volatile material, the chaos, the pain, the void. But the bands were the stable structure, the refining process that transmuted that chaos into coherent, transcendent art. Without the band, the frontman is just a broken, talented person. With the band, the brokenness becomes commercially viable transcendence.
Let's start with Morrison tuning the shaman. It's fascinating that the crucial structure for his manic chaos came from the highly trained keyboardist Ray Manzarek.
It's the ultimate counterpoint, isn't it? Manzarek was classically trained, and his signature hypnotic organ lines provided the necessary structure, the melodic tether, for Morrison's unhinged shamanic flights and his spontaneous poetry.
So Morrison was pure, untamed chaos.
Pure improvisation. And Manzarek was the grounded intellectual who anchored those wild improvisations in musical reality.
The sources refer to the Vox Continental organ literally becoming the pulpit for Morrison's sermons.
Which is such a great image. It was the platform that made his most dangerous and transgressive ideas accessible and, consumable to a mass audience. And that structure immediately led to their manifesto. Their debut, Break On Through, is pure transgression and a powerful statement of intent.
It's the first scream of a soul refusing to be contained by the 1950s structures his admiral father represented.
It's a demand to shatter all barriers, the cultural, the psychological, the sonic. The lyric, Break On Through to the Other Side, wasn't a suggestion. It was an imperative born from a life defined by military rigidity and the need to escape it.
Moving to Cornell, tuning the Gnostic Sage.
Yeah.
His incredible 4-octave vocal range, it's a supernatural instrument. It required a massive counterweight from the Soundgarden rhythm section to avoid just floating off into the ether.
His voice absolutely needed to be grounded by the complexity and darkness of the Seattle environment. That counterweight came from Kim Thayil's heavy, often dissonant guitar work, and crucially, their signature use of odd time signatures. Think about tracks like Outshined in '74 or Fell on Black Days in '64.
Okay, for our listeners who aren't musicians, why does using an odd time signature like 74 instead of standard 44 create that feeling of anxiety and claustrophobia that permeates their sound?
It subtly shifts the listener's expectation of stability. Standard 44 is comfortable, it resolves cleanly. When you listen to 74, the beat is subtly jarring, always slightly uneven, always missing that final grounding beat, or adding an extra beat where you don't expect it. This rhythmic complexity creates a jarring, uneasy sonic landscape that perfectly mirrors Cornell's internal battle with anxiety and existential dread. It sounds unbalanced because it is mathematically unbalanced.
And his early theme reflects that internal siege perfectly. The debut lyrics from Hunted Down are incredibly paranoid and claustrophobic.
They're out to get me, he sings. It establishes an early theme of persecution and internal siege, reflecting the depression he battled from youth long before fame ever entered the picture. It's a cry of entrapment, starkly different from Morrison's cry for chaotic liberation. Cornell was always searching for freedom within himself, not just external boundaries to break.
Then we have Weiland, the chameleon. His fundamental need for a stable self meant his band needed to provide a foundation that allowed him to shift shapes constantly.
Right, from grunge growler to glam poet and back again.
And that extraordinary versatility was delivered by the DeLeo brothers, Dean and Robert. They didn't just play rock, they provided a deep, sophisticated, jazz-inflected musical foundation. This musical literacy allowed Weiland to shift seamlessly between the heavy rock of core and the sophisticated, often psychedelic, glam-influenced pop of tiny music.
It meant that no matter how much Weiland changed his clothes or his vocal style, the music itself remained technically solid and interesting, providing the necessary continuity for his fragmented identity.
The canvas.
Exactly. The sophistication of their chord voicings and arrangements, the use of major seventh chords in places where grunge would usually demand power chords, provided a canvas big enough for Weiland to perform his multiple selves without the entire project falling apart.
And his early theme, Dead and Bloated, is a declaration of decay right from the starting line. an immediate confrontation with the emptiness he was trying to fill.
It's grotesque and nihilistic. The sources point out that he starts the song singing through a megaphone,
A specific choice.
a specific technological choice to distort and distance his voice. It's a subtle way of hiding. He wanted to be heard but not felt directly, creating a sonic barrier that reflected his fragmented and traumatized identity already decaying beneath the surface.
Finally, Michael Hutchence, tuning the sensualist. Ion XS required a tight, incredibly funky machine to support his fluid, mesmerizing stage presence.
Hutchence was defined by his visceral connection to the audience, his ability to embody sex and movement. Andrew Ferris's rhythmic precision and the band's tight funk rock foundation acted as the essential tether. The band was a precise, syncopated clockwork that allowed Michael to be the wild god on stage.
Ferris provided the groove.
The tight, driving groove and syncopation that allowed Michael to seduce the audience with fluidity and confidence without the whole musical structure just collapsing into formlessness.
His early themes, like Just Keep Walking, focus on that immediate, visceral need for urban survival. It kind of lacks the metaphysical weight of Morrison or the heavy introspection of Cornell. It's about movement as a biological necessity.
It's focused on the tangible and the immediate, rather than the eternal or the psychological. It reflects the constant need to prove his existence, driven by the anxiety that if he stops walking, he might disappear entirely, swallowed up by that corporate void his transient childhood created.
So we've traced the psychological blueprint, the geographical materials, and the professional construction crew. Now for the final synthesis. The cost of the art and the enduring, tragic echo they left behind.
We can summarize the dual forces that define these four men. The paternal shadow set the trajectory for their rebellion, patricide, superficiality, or abandonment, and the geography provided the stylistic execution.
The LA men.
The LA men Morrison and Weiland built their artistic houses of neon and glass, favoring theatrical performance and shifting personas. The Seattle man Cornell built his of heavy stone, demanding internal conflict and sonic grounded weight. Hutchence, the global transient, built his house of pure, tight rhythm, designed for movement.
Let's spend a moment on the 1967 crew theory because it contextualizes Weiland and Cornell's experience in a unique, tragic, sociological light.
This is a fascinating sociological observation from the source material. It posits that those born around 1967, so Weiland, Kurt Cobain, 1967, Lane Staley, 1967, and Shannon Hoon, 1967, were a specific psychological byproduct of the era's sociological chaos,
They were born during the zenith of the counterculture.
but grew up during the economic and social fallout of the 70s and 80s. They missed the idealism of the 60s and inherited the cynicism of the broken 70s.
Exactly. They were generationally encoded with a nihilism that predisposed them to burn out, rather than the structured long-term survival of the preceding generation. They witnessed the collapse of every social structure. The political hope, the nuclear family, the promise of economic stability. They were highly sensitive, highly creative individuals who were forced to build on shifting sands, and Weiland carried the ultimate burden of this cohort, living well past the deaths of his contemporaries.
He became the designated survivor. By the mid-90s, Cobain and Staley were gone, and Hoon had followed. Weiland's continued survival, despite his ongoing battles, paradoxically became his burden. He was forced to carry the torch of grunge dysfunction, that raw, existential pain, into the new millennium.
A role that only deepened his reliance on chemical escape as a means of coping with the identity he was now forced to perform.
Sadly, yes.
And even in their final, tragic acts, the themes that defined their lives persisted, kind of closing the loop on the voids they were desperately trying to fill.
Jim Morrison, defined by his war against authority and his desire to be the serious poet, sought autonomy and poetic exile in Paris in 1971. He was trying to shed the Lizard King rock star persona,
The theatrical performance.
desperately seeking the anonymity of the exile to find the word, the poetic truth, in silence, away from the LA neon. His death was a final, tragic attempt at self-redefinition.
Hutchence's final hours are perhaps the most medically and tragically ironic.
The sensualist lost his senses. The sources emphasized the 1992 assault that caused frontal lobe damage resulted in anosmia, the loss of smell and taste. For a man whose entire performance was defined by visceral, intense sensation, the loss of two fundamental senses was a devastating blow, compounding his despair in his final years.
So the brain injury.
The brain injury, combined with chemical escape and custody battles, created a perfect storm. The wild god died in a confusing, lonely reality. a tragedy defined by the cruel irony of physical injury.
Weiland's death was the grim, unglamorous end of the aging addict, perfectly reflecting the fragmentation and exhaustion of the transient child.
His death on the tour bus in Minnesota, found deceased in a bedroom with cocaine baggies nearby, was the antithesis of the romantic rock death. The road, which was supposed to be the symbol of his rootless freedom, became a literal dead end, a cramped, isolating box. The Chameleon's Collapse, a tragic portrait of diminishing returns for a man who spent his life perpetually searching for home and self, finally collapsing in the ultimate state of transience.
And Cornell, the sage, the ultimate survivor of the grunge wave, finally surrendered to the darkness he had sung about for decades.
Cornell's suicide, after years of battling lifelong depression, was linked to chemical impairment. The sources note the ativan in his system suggests a chemical factor that may have caused dissociation or severe disinhibition, allowing the suicidal impulse to take hold after years of managing it. It was the sage's final devastating surrender to the black hole sun he sang about, the internal darkness he had tried so hard to anchor with heavy stone and complexity.
What stands out, connecting back to our core concept, is that the sources repeatedly state that the bands were the bridge, the alchemy that transmuted the artist's raw foundational pain into art we still cherish. The art, therefore, required this tension, this pain, this broken blueprint.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us, the listeners, to confront a really uncomfortable truth. We celebrate the poetry, the profound depth of Cornell's anguish, the dangerous allure of Morrison's rebellion, the fractured charisma of Weiland, the desperate sensuality of Hutchence. But the bands, Manzarek's organ, Teo's riffs, the DeLeo's jazz chords, Ferris's precision, they could only perform that alchemy on the raw materials provided by those fundamental broken dynamics.
So did the quality of the art, the ability to make it rain like Hutchence sang about in Elegantly Wasted, that ability to conjure transcendence, did it depend entirely on their inability to find personal peace or stability? The profound beauty of their music seems utterly inseparable from the profound chaos and trauma of their internal worlds.
The music is, in essence, a record of their survival mechanisms failing. They were uniquely gifted at turning their specific traumas, patricide, cultural whiplash, a corporate void, into universally appealing musical language. The enduring echo they leave is the tension between the artistic transcendence they achieved and the devastating human cost it exacted. We celebrate the unique voice and the sound it created, but we have to acknowledge that the void was the source code for the poetry.